So today in Advanced Algebra 1, we are going to continue with interpreting graphs. On the first interpreting graphs lesson, the practice 2.2, we looked at intercepts and increasing and decreasing. So for this lesson, we are going to look at a couple of different things. We're going to look at positive versus negative. So that's something a little bit different. And then we're also going to practice describing the entire graph versus just one point. So if you notice, these graphs and these problems are exactly the same as 2.3, but we're just doing some different pieces that we did not cover back on 2.2. So same problems, same types of graphs, so they should look very similar. We are just looking at positive and negative and then describing the entire graph. So on 2.2, where we highlighted our increasing and our decreasing, this time we're not going to highlight increasing and decreasing because that's not something that we're practicing. We are just going to highlight the x-axis because this is kind of our dividing line for negative and positive. So I'm just going to have you highlight the x-axis because this is our dividing line for negative and positive. Positive is above the x-axis, and if we had something below, that would be negative. Okay. Now as far as positive and negative go, it's exactly like increasing and decreasing. We're going to use that x-axis. We're going to use our values and say something along the lines of like x from x equals 0 to x equals whatever number it goes to. So that will look very similar for positive and negative, just like it did on increasing and decreasing. So for looking at number 1, the entire graph is above the x-axis. There is nothing that goes below. So my negative is that 0 with a slash through it. There is no negative portion of this graph. It is all positive. It's all above the x-axis. So then for my positive, I'll say from x equals 0, remember that's your starting point, x equals 0, and this one went over to x equals 10. So from x equals 0 to x equals 10 is our positive. That would have also been the same thing for our decreasing. Since it decreased the whole time, we would have written the exact same thing on decreasing as well. Alright, so then for describing the graph, we just kind of want to look at, based kind of your first point, where does it start? And on this one, where does it end? So we're just going to kind of talk about where it starts, what's going on, where it ends, because this is a linear graph. It doesn't change at all. So this one will be pretty straightforward. On graphs that are a little bit more complicated, if they have curves or their lines go up and down a little bit more, then we'll have to put a little bit more into our explaining. But this one should be pretty straightforward. We're just going to kind of talk about how it starts, what happens, and how it ends. So for this one, 0, remember, was 2007. 0 represents 2007, so I'm going to say in 2007, there are about 241 right whales, and that's what we had for our intercept on 2.2. When we talked about the y-intercept, we said it was just a little over 240. So in 2007, there are about 241 right whales, and then I noticed that it is slowly decreasing. The population is decreasing because my line is going down. So in 2007, there are about 241 right whales, but the population is decreasing. So it decreases, and then at the end, after 10 generations, there will be no more right whales, because it is down to 0. The population's down to 0. So it starts 2007, there are about 241 right whales, but the population is decreasing. After 10 generations, there will be no more right whales. So I just kind of explained the entire graph, what was happening at the beginning, what happened through the middle, and then how it ended. So pretty simple graph, pretty simple explanation. A little more complicated graph might have a little bit more complicated explanation. All right, moving on to number 2. So again, I'm just going to highlight my x-axis. That way it's a little bit easier for me to see positive versus negative. Okay, so on this one, if you recall back to the last practice, this was the height of a golf ball. The golf ball starts on the tee, goes up about 140 feet, and then comes back down. Okay, so for this one, again, there is no negative. None of this graph is below the x-axis. None of the graph is below the x-axis, so there is no negative. And then we're going to say it's positive from 0 all the way to 120. So it's positive, the whole thing's positive from x equals 0 to x equals 120. All right, so for describing this graph, again, I kind of want to talk about where it starts, what happens, so where it maybe gets to its highest point, and then where it lands. So where it starts, well, like any golf ball, it's starting on the ground. It's 0 height, 0 feet for the height, 0 distance from the tees. So I'm going to do my first sentence. The ball started on the ground. Okay, and then after it was hit, it got up to approximately 140 feet. So that was the highest point. So there's my second sentence. After it was hit, it got up to approximately 140 feet high. And then it came back down, and where did it land? Approximately 120 yards away from the tee. So it then landed on the ground 120 yards away. And again, on these descriptions, as long as you're hitting the main points, even if your wording is a little bit different than mine, that's okay. I just want to make sure that we are hitting the major points of the graph. So definitely where it starts, where it ends, and then if there's a spot in the middle that you can talk about, that's usually something that you should add in as well. So the ball started on the ground. After it was hit, it got up to approximately 140 feet high, and then it landed on the ground 120 yards away. Okay, so then on to number 3. Now this was our one that got a little bit more complicated. Now here we have our x-axis in the middle, so we can see that we're going to have some negative and some positive on this one, because we've got stuff on either side. So for let's start with my positive, because the only part that's positive is right here. So we said on our last lesson we called this about 5.5 and we called this about 6.5. We'll just kind of keep them right in the middle. So from 5.5 to 6.5 approximately, that's where it's positive. That's the only part that's above the x-axis. from x is approximately 5.5 to x is approximately 6.5. So then the rest of my graph from 0 up to 5.5 is negative, and then from 6.5 on is negative. And we had kind of talked about this last time with decreasing, that we just say that x is greater than 6.5, because we don't know if it ends on 7, we're not exactly sure where it ends. So for negative, first part from 0 to about 5.5. And when x is greater than approximately 6.5. There's that second little spot that is negative. Okay, so for describing your graph, again, this was kind of the swimming pattern of a blue dolphin. Started at the surface, dove down, came back up, jumped up in the air, and then dove back down again. Okay, so I'm going to say something about after the dolphin entered the water, he swam down about, we'll call that 1.5, about 1.5 meters, and then came back up. So I kind of have two pieces. After the dolphin entered the water, he swam down about 1.5 meters and then came back up. So that takes care of that chunk of my graph. Okay, so after the dolphin entered the water, he swam down about 1.5 meters and then came back up. He then jumped out of the water at 5.5 seconds and then dove back in. He then jumped out of the water at 5.5 seconds. And then dove back in. So I had to get a little more creative with describing this graph, making sure I kind of talked about where it was at in the water. 1.5 down, came back up to the surface. Now, I'm not exactly sure how high. You could also add in how high you think it might have dove out of the water, but that'd be kind of a hard one to estimate, maybe like 0.3 meters or something. So if you talked about that, that would be okay. But I went ahead and talked about the time, because that was something we had included earlier in our positive, negative, increasing, decreasing. So that's where I included the time there. But I didn't re-include 6.5. If you wanted to, you could. Again, there is some flexibility in kind of what you pick, just as long as you describe the entire graph. So I've just picked a couple of things to talk about, but there were a couple more. If you wanted to include those or talk about them instead, you could have. All right, one more. Again, this was the height of the diver. The diver's on the diving board. He jumps up and then dives down. So again, if I highlight my x-axis, I am back to another graph that has no negative. This graph does not go below the x-axis at all. No negative, all positive. And this one goes to 1.75. We said that was 1.75. So my positive is from x equals 0 to x equals 1.75. The whole graph is positive, no negatives. So then again, for describing the graph, our graph is a little less complicated than number 3, so my describing should be a little bit easier. Probably say something about where my diver starts. So the diver starts 10 meters above the water. He jumps up, and then he comes back down, and he lands in the water 1.75 seconds later. So I'm just kind of describe the beginning, what happened, and the end. So the diver starts. "10 meters above the water." Jumps up. And then lands in the water. .75 seconds later. So he started 10 meters above the water, jumped up, and then came down and landed in the water 1.75 seconds later. So I made sure I talked about both my start and my end for that one. So the little more simple graphs, there's not a whole lot extra that you can add in. You just kind of have to keep it pretty simple. And then on the more complicated graphs, there's a little more that you can always add in if you want to. Okay? So between those 2 lessons, that pretty much covers being able to interpret an entire graph, both your positive, negative, increasing, decreasing, intercepts, linear versus nonlinear, describing an individual point, and describing the whole graph. So between those 2 lessons, you kind of have all the different ways that you can describe your graphs. If there's anything on 2-3 that you are not sure about or that you need some additional help with, though, please make sure you come and find me, and I will be happy to help you.